Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. I'm here to ask and answer one simple question. WTF is Pandora First Contact. It's a sci-fi 4X strategy game by Proxy Studios that was released actually last year, but only made its way to Steam at the end of May in 2014. What is it? It is best described by relating it to another game that it was heavily inspired by. And that is, of course, Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri, which is getting a sort of pseudo-spiritual sequel in the form of Civilization Beyond Earth later on. But in the meantime, along comes Pandora First Contact, and when looking at a game like this, you certainly have to look at where it came from, why it came from, and whether or not it ended up really living up to the legacy of what many consider to be an absolute classic. I remember the Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri battle. It came out around the same time as another Civ title, not made by Sid Meier, though. It was a title called Civilization Call to Power. I think it was actually called... Was it Call to Power 2 that came out? I can't remember which, but Call to Power 2 was actually pretty good, surprisingly enough. And then, of course, Sid Meier got control of the series back. It was a bit of a weird time. Whatever the case, Pandora First Contact has a lot to live up to, because Alpha Centauri is certainly one of my favorite 4X games. So let's have a look at what is available here. A decent number of options to customize your experience is very important when dealing with a turn-based game. You've got to be able to have tips, leaving on cutscenes or turning them off if you've played them multiple times, auto-cycling units and showing health bars, and of course showing the grid. These are all very useful things. Unfortunately, this does not include the ability to rebind certain keys. Of course, you can use hotkeys in a game like this, and you probably should, because it'll speed up your experience, but what I would like, considering that, well, if we keep an eye on this cursor, it's going to wander off the screen. Oh, look, it wandered off the screen. How did that happen? There is no constrain to monitor option, which means that if you are playing on two monitors, which many PC gamers do, then you'll probably wander off the screen if you're going to use the push scroll, which is not ideal. So what I would have liked to do is rebind my scroll keys to scroll the map to the WASD. Of course, because that's the left hand, my mouse is on the right hand, but as it turns out, I've used the cursor keys for that, which, you know, it's not a very good idea. I'm not left-handed, but there you go. Automation, very important. You know, this is exactly what you would expect out of any kind of Civilization-esque title. You have formers, which is actually the same name, I might add, as the same unit in Alpha Centauri, so an obvious nod there. And you can turn off the automation for certain things. Most of the time, the formers do a pretty good job, so you usually don't have to mess around unless you really want to tweak things. Video options, not much here. This full screen is a lie, unfortunately. It is... Well, I mean, it's hard to say that this is full screen window because it has windowed and decorated, which is the same thing. But like I've shown you here, the cursor can wander off the screen. It's just a constraint issue that needs to be fixed. You can change the font, which is quite nice. I like that. And then you can mess around with texture quality, shadow, and AA, plus VSync. Nothing particularly surprising about any of this, honestly. It's not an incredible looking game, but it is a 4X strategy, so there's not really a lot to say about that. Separate audio slides for pretty much everything, though. Gotta love that. There's perhaps even more than you would expect necessarily, so it's good to see that's there. And then your network options and your ports and so on and so forth. And that's pretty much about it. So, missing the ability to rebind your keys and missing the ability to constrain mouse cursor to the actual game itself. Both of those are fairly important, and I think they should be added. This game has been out for quite some time. I'm fairly surprised no one's provided that feedback yet. Now, this version... Yeah, I'm not going to mess around with that. This version has a free expansion, which is... It's not really an expansion per se, because it doesn't add an awful lot other than this sort of third-party AI faction that will come in at about... I don't know how many turns it comes in, but they'll start to hit you around the second era, and it's a bunch of aliens that invade your planet. They're initially fairly threatening, but once your technology gets up there, considering these guys don't really scale in any way, they're fairly easy to wipe out. So, not particularly difficult, but there is a patch which gives you access to that. Alright, let's jump into a game. I'm pretty far into this one. This first impression comes with probably around 7-8 hours of gameplay experience. I mean, that's pretty much what you need to dig into a turn-based game, so shouldn't really surprise you in any way. Alright, I have a fairly large empire. I think I'm the most powerful in the world. I'm very, very rich. As you can see here, I get 1,309 credits a turn. That's a lot of credits. That's enough credits to buy myself one of the most powerful units in the game with very good equipment. Just straight up. It's called the Goliath Mech. It's right here. It isn't the most powerful. Many would argue that the new aircraft with the advanced cost computation device is ridiculously powerful, but I could buy the Goliath Mech for 1,152 credits. Now, this looks immediately familiar to you, as well it should. It is very, very similar to Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri in many different ways. The city design works for the most part in the same way. You have formers that wander around and terraform the landscape, as you can see right here. These are all improved. Like, every single tile that I have access to in this terrain is improved. And I started a war just prior to this. I started fighting against this corporation here, and I've just kind of been wiping them off the face of this island. I have control of most of this main island right here, as you can see. This was a civilization that I flattened. This island, they're friends with me, so I don't mind them too much, and then you've got this island here and this island. So all of this is randomly generated. There's not a huge number of options in the creation, and I will show you that, actually, towards the end of the video, because I remember some of you complaining that I didn't do that during the Age of Wonders video, so I'll make sure not to repeat that mistake. But outside of that, it does look very similar, and you should find most things immediately familiar. Now, unlike Civ 5, this is more like playing Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri. That means you can have unit stacks. You'll see there's a stack of units right there. It is hex-based, as you can see. That seems to be the way of doing things these days. But you can still have the stacks regardless. So if I wanted to send my Goliath Mech over there, it's going to stack up with these, and that's the combined power of those units, and you'll end up fighting one at a time, as you might imagine. And of course, since we have roads here, these things will move around fairly easily. There's not really much to say about the units, because they kind of act in the same way as most units in these kind of games, very similar to Civilization. You target something, you move it onto the target, and it will attack, and it will usually be like 1 hex range. There are artillery units that have 2 hex range, as well as snipers, which do a fairly similar thing. And you can design your units by using the workshop. This looks very similar to Alpha Centauri as well, although admittedly, I've got to admit, the interface for this game is actually pretty good. Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri was a little convoluted in terms of its interface. These guys over at Proxy have done a good job of taking that and sorting things out. So let's create a new unit. There we go. So if I create new, there we go. Colonizer class. All right, so you can go through the various classes of unit here. So that is the NU aircraft. It is like the best aircraft in the game. And there are 3 tiers of most of the units, as far as I'm aware. I may have missed something key that allowed me to get a better version of the tank. But things like the Goliath Mech, I'm pretty sure there's only one version of this. This is the most powerful kind of big ground unit in the game. And you can then customize it with weapons. Again, most of these are 3 tiers if you research them. I'm missing quite a few tiers of weapons at the moment. But I have tier 3 automatic weapons. So I could give it the Dafobus, which is a set of fairly heavy cannons there. That's the Gorse Gatling gun, and this is the L-15 Lance gun. There is no reason to use previous tier stuff unless it's the only thing you've got access to, or if you really want to build a very cheap unit very quickly, because of course this increases the cost and the production time of these units. You can then pick an armor type. Again, no reason to pick the previous types of armor. All of the armor is just better than the previous tier. There's no special kinds of armor, which is actually very disappointing. Something, of course, Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri did pretty well. In fact, that's actually how I describe a lot of the technology in this game. It is very, very iterative, and you just get better versions of things. Like, why would you build a Seeker ATV when you have a long-haul ATV? The answer is you wouldn't. Press Enter troops are better than the assault troops, which are better than the colonial troops. That's how it works. And the only benefit to picking the other one is that it costs less. And you'll see that there's a fairly basic multiplication here. That is 16 resources, 32 resources, 64 resources. And things will multiply. This has got 4 times the power of the colonial trooper. So, it's all sort of run-of-the-mill and a bit pedestrian when it comes to the tech upgrades. Although, if we have a look at technology, we can see exactly how that works. So, this tech tree right here is randomized every game, alright? So, you will not necessarily get the same order of things every game, but everything is also tiered. So, you're not gonna research the new aircraft, like right here. That's not gonna happen. There are various tiers of technology, but how you get there is different every time. As far as I can tell, every technology is still going to be available, although where you get it from is going to be completely different. If there is a new tier of tank, I have yet to find one. What I'd like to see, especially once you get to this stage of the game where maybe you've pursued... Actually, there is another one. There it is, the Demolisher tank. I must have missed that one. I wonder if there's a tier 3 tank. No, there's a tier 3 water aircraft. Tier 3 tank anywhere? Tier 3 tank? There might be here. Maybe over here. Now, what you may be noticing as we go through this is that, oh, some of these... I'm not seeing any tech here. Well, there's a reason for that. They've got what's called the blind tech tree, and you can customize just how blind it is every time. So, because I haven't gone down this path, I don't even know what's here. I have no idea. I'd have to research some stuff to figure that out. So, we're going to do a couple of turns. I'm just going to make sure that I'm not going to get completely and totally obliterated by these guys. I should probably buy some more new aircraft, but they're very expensive. They're also, like, ridiculous. With the upgrade that I gave them, they are completely and totally overpowered. So, we could fight here. Yeah, why not? Oh, we could nuke him. That might be fun. I don't know if there's a blast radius on this thing. Let's see. Damage to all units and population of the territory. Doesn't look like it. Nuke him! There we go. Nuclear missile. Yep, and they definitely didn't like me for that one. And now we're just going to try and murder them. There we go, so we should be able to cut them down without too much of a problem and hopefully take over that city. That's probably going to piss off a lot of the factions in the game, but I just wanted to show you the nuclear missiles. They actually appear under this window called Operations, which is an interesting twist. Operations you can research, and they're things that you can do from time to time. So I could research field training, or I could, well, buy it, and that would allow me to... It's a spell. You know, call it what it is, it's basically a spell. So I can cast field training, which will train up a bunch of units, but it'll do health damage to them. You can do a bunch of other stuff, like once you've got orbital bombardment uplinks, you can do orbital bombardment, which is, again, a basic spell. Satellite scans. I pretty much know what's going on here, but if I want to know what's going on right now, throw down a satellite scan, throw down another one. So that's what operations do. Alright, we're going to skip forward, I think, a few turns here. I'm pretty sure they're wiped out on this island. They may try and attack me through here, but I've got, like, 3 Goliath mechs on that, so I don't see any of them breaking that anytime soon. Goliath mechs are really powerful. Alright, so we'll skip through the next turn. The frame rate does tend to drop while it's doing all its calculations. This is maybe something that needs to be optimized in a pretty big way. Not that it really matters. Like, the frame rate does recover after the turn, so it's not the worst thing to ever happen. It's not really that important. Oh, they're trying to use strike aircraft on me. That's adorable. Let's send in the Goliath mechs, shall we? There we go. And we'll take over the Sun Tzu city, which, surprisingly enough, is not actually covered in pollution from the fallout, but there you go. Okay. And we'll be one turn away from Golden Age, and then we'll go and do some other stuff. Yeah, I think we can just skip another turn here. We're fairly secure. They'll probably try and fight me over here, but we've pretty much wiped out their forces over there, so it is what it is. Now, outside of the stuff that you're clearly seeing going on right here, there are a few nasty little beasties you've got to deal with. As you might imagine, when you land on the planet, you will be dealing with native life. Now, we pretty much wiped most of that out outside of the fungus here, which actually does damage if you stand in it, so you got to watch out. Very similar to... It was actually fungus in Alpha Centauri, wasn't it? And the mind worms and things like that. Well, there's various kinds of flora and fauna that will harass you throughout this game. Most of them are extremely unpleasant, and you have to avoid really engaging with them directly early on until you have the forces to break them and destroy their hives and things like that. You can also enslave them. You can take control of them, as you might imagine. This is how overpowered the new aircraft is with this gadget, by the way, that I've put on, which allows me to use a movement point and keep attacking. So I can devastate an entire stack of units with this thing. It's actually just silly. Really, really overpowered. I think it's probably their fault for not researching flak, but any other unit that they're using right here against me is not even going to work. I actually might lose my new aircraft here. This was actually a mistake. I shouldn't have done that. Yep, that was dumb. There's 3,000 credits down the drain. I guess we'll just have to march in there with a Goliath instead. There we go. Now that should devastate their defenses quite easily. It's alright, we have more new aircraft just lying around. I've been buying my way to victory here quite effectively. But once you have cleared those out, and they are quite dangerous. Jeez, that's a lot. I should probably nuke them. They are very dangerous, no doubt about that. And you have to avoid the roaming ones and don't piss them off too much. There's technology which makes them less aggressive and things like that, but you do have to watch out for the large roaming beasties. But once you've gained a certain level of technology, you can destroy them very easily, and they cease to become a factor. It's a bit of a shame because, you know, I'm going to bring up the Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri comparison because quite obviously this game was very much inspired by it. The way that they did it in Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri is... Let's go fusion beams instead. That should unlock this section. Is that they really powered up the creatures on the planet throughout the game, and they still were very, very relevant. That was mostly because they used psychic attacks, which actually scaled in a different way to the regular attacks in this game. Now, this game does have different weapon types, so instead of just doing damage, if we go back to the workshop for a second, we can have a look at the weapons. This one, the automatic weapons, good against biological units, not so good against mechanical units, can be used on pretty much everything, but hammerhead missile launchers, very good against mechanical units. I don't actually have that many choices on the Goliath Mech. They can't equip that many different weapons, but if I pick the Avenger tank, now that would have a different way of doing things. If we look at that, you got the Serenity Cannon here, which is very much an anti-tank weapon. Terrible against airborne units, terrible against light units. The Long Tom and Gunther artillery weapons, as you can see here, with the splash damage and all that kind of stuff. And I actually haven't researched any flak weapons at all. That's just the way that this game can go, because the tech trees are so randomized. Sometimes you just end up without a key piece of technology. And, like, with these guys, if they actually had any flak weapons at all, they would probably be able to resist my new aircraft, but they can't. And this new aircraft is just absolutely devastating them. And we'll send in the Goliath Mech to do yet more damage there too, and artillery would probably be pretty effective against this city. But like I said, once you've got a certain level of technology, the local wildlife is not a problem anymore, and it doesn't scale very well. And the alien invasion is very similar. When it happens the first time, it's pretty scary. They start throwing some really nasty stuff at you, generally like kind of tier 2 technology. They're difficult to handle initially, but once you get a handle on them, there's nothing really to worry about, and you will outpace them, and they seem like they'll never come back after that. So they're more of a little minor hazard and inconvenience more so than anything else, which is a bit of a shame. And this is one of the things that I feel that Pandora First Contact kind of missed the point of. Yeah, I'd go as far as to say that. It kind of missed the point when it came to making a game that was maybe let's be kind and say an homage to the style of Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri. The problem is that Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri kept the pace up all the way into the late game, and it kept the planet as a theme. Yeah, the planet was a key theme to the story, and yes, that game did have a story, and it was also key to the gameplay mechanics, because the planet would rise up against you, it would gain power as you did, and there were some really nice story elements tied into it, particularly, of course, if you're playing the Gaian faction. Now, here, the planet seems like more of a minor obstacle. It seems very hostile initially, but taming the planet is not that hard. And once you've tamed the planet, you don't have to worry about the planet anymore. That's a shame. I think that could have been done a hell of a lot better. And having more of those elements in it would have been pretty fantastic. But it doesn't seem to be here. And I'm fairly far into the game, as you can see. You know, this is the end of the tech tree right here. At least my version of the tech tree. The Transcendence era seems to be the last era in the game. As far as I know, it may be that somehow it's not letting me see any further than this, and I maybe have to keep going, but it certainly seems like the way. And you'll notice now that I've unlocked things like the orbital cannon, and that's as a direct result of going into this, get antimatter missile launcher, and I can keep doing some pretty neat stuff, and there's still a good amount of technology. There's a lot of technology, but the technology is, as I said, very tiered, so not necessarily as fun as I would have hoped for, because it's like, well, this is a better version of the previous gun you had. But there's still a decent amount of variety of weapons anyway, even though each of them have 3 tiers. Alright, so we've pretty much wiped out the forces here. We can probably fall our Goliath Mech back to Havel there, and we can continue with this. This needs to go and repair. The new aircraft's been damaged pretty badly, but I have a new aircraft. That's hard to say. I shouldn't say that. Send the new aircraft in there to finish them off. We can do an orbital bombardment if we like. That's pretty good at sinking. Yeah, let's sink that boat with an orbital bombardment. There we go. Not too bad. And then I think, yeah, we've finished that off, and then we can just take the city, no problem at all. Nice and easy. Let's talk about the economy, shall we? Because there are some interesting changes with this. Now, a lot of resources in this game are global, so obviously credits are going to be global, but you also have global food, which is actually kind of great. I hate the idea of on a future planet where you can literally put your brain into a computer that we can't figure out lorries. If Walmart can figure out lorries, space can figure out lorries. Thank you very much. So you don't have starving cities or anything like that, and there are some games in this genre that do that. So you have this global pool of food. You also have a global pool of minerals, and when you produce things, it will use minerals to do it. If you run out of minerals, you will slow down your production.
production. These have to be mined. So let's go to... Let's find one of our... Byzantium's a pretty good example of this. Actually, no. Sogdian rock. Because it's got a really big mineral mine in the Noxium field over there. So... You'll see this is how many minerals it's bringing in, and it's bringing that in because I have a certain number of miners assigned. Now, each city has a set limit of these, depending on how many areas around it can be mined. So there is one more area I could mine if I took a farmer and I placed that down there. And you may have noticed on the hexes something lit up. There you go. So each of these hexes has a certain number of things that can be generated from it. In this case, I am mining from this area. And I've got the maximum number of miners. There is no other area here that would provide me with minerals. So that's how that works. Workers are used to produce things. I've got to the point where I'm not even producing anything because I have so much money that I just buy it. Let's buy a golden age. There we go. Because I can. I'm one of the corporate factions. I have so much cash that I can just buy anything I want. So I actually turned workers to 0 and went full-on research, which is kind of a cool way of doing things. I like it. And then research is global as well, which is generated kind of in the same way. There are a couple of interesting ideas, though. Obviously, morale's in there, but morale is affected by something called habitat, which is living space. So what will happen is if your cities get overcrowded, you will lose habitat points, and if you don't have enough habitats built, which are generally buildings and technologies which allow you to do that, then people will become unhappy. They'll also migrate from your city. The growth rate can actually go to negative, and people will leave one city to go to another, and that's called the migration system, which is a pretty neat way of doing things. Overall, though, this menu is really nicely represented, and I love the idea of the little soldiers here. This actually reminds me of Master of Orion 2, the way that they visually represented things, and it's a good way to do it. Like, if I click here, I can move all of these farmers over into workers. It's really easy, and you get a full-on visual representation of everything that happens there immediately. So, you know, I've been praising the interface time and time again, but I think, you know, there's a very good reason to praise the interface, because this is all really nicely put together, and it shows pretty much everything at a glance. Cool. Yeah, it works fairly well. If I go to economy as well, you'll also notice that you can control all the cities from this one menu, which is nice, and it'll allow you to use drop-downs to not only buy things, but also put things into production and move everything. This is you know, it's really nicely put together. What else can I say? Really good UI, which is one of the big edges it does have over Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri. It is not as good as Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri, not even close. You know, it's got a lot of things wrong with it, in terms of it thematically, in terms of the sort of fairly pedestrian way that it does technology and tiering, in terms of the way that the PvE works, in terms of the diplomacy, in terms of the general fluff and lore. All of that's weaker. It doesn't even have a special ops system. You know, there's no spying or espionage or anything going on, which is weird because other factions will accuse you of it, even though it's mechanically impossible. But this UI is really, really good. Very, very well designed. It's got almost everything I could possibly want, with the exception of the texture UI allowing you to search for things. You've got to just learn the icons, basically. Like, because I missed the tank completely. Like, I'd like to search for unit type tank, and then have it show where it is on the tree and what I need to research it. So, there is that. But yeah, the UI is great. Absolutely fantastic, and everything is made very, very obvious and is very well visually represented. And visuals-wise, not bad either. You know, these fungus look absolutely hideous, but the cities look good. Overall, the improvements that are being made are very obvious. There's some pretty cool models there as well. That's a field laboratory over there. Nice little pieces of detail. I've got some pollution processors around here somewhere, actually. Those look pretty good. There's a pollution processor. It looks good, you know, a very nice futuristic look, and the models have a reasonable amount of detail. Texture quality not brilliant, but once you zoomed out at this point, it makes very little difference. And the battle effects are okay too, if a little bit samey from time to time. Now, what I would say is the diplomacy aspect is seriously lacking for very, very many reasons. For one, I actually had to restart my game about 4 or 5 times because even on medium difficulty, the diplomacy has a very interesting twist to it. That being, everyone wants to kill you if you lag behind in units. And it's almost always these bastards, the Divine Ascension. Every bloody time. I've been attacked by the Imperium and the Solar Dynasty before, but it's mostly the Divine Ascension. And you could do nothing to provoke it, and they will bloody kill you anyway. They don't care. They will murder you. It's really, really unpleasant. And I had to restart several games as a direct result. My rocket tank is probably not up to snuff, but I'll give it a chance. 59% chance to win. And that was a dismal failure. Never mind. They probably won't be able to fight me anyway. Wow, they actually have a Dreadnought watercraft. I don't have one of those. Thankfully, they're allied with me, so I'm not too worried. It's an okay. It's not too bad. There we go. Wow, that's such a good unit. It's just god tier. As far as I know, there are no other versions of the Goliath Mech, which actually I found fairly disappointing. They may be hidden in the tech tree somewhere, but I did search online and I found no reference to it. And the manual doesn't tell you what the techs are either, because I assume they want that element of mystery going on there. But there you go. Let's buy a market regulator. There we go. We need more cash. Absolutely, we need more cash. Diplomacy, unfortunately, as I said, is pretty weak. The options are very obvious. If I talk to the Terra Salvum, for instance, declare war on a third party, give me money, here let me give you money. You can't give technology, as far as I know. The only gift you can give is cash, so I guess it makes sense because the blind tech tree applies to everybody, so giving technology and trading technology would be, well, it would break the way that the mechanics work. And then there's things like non-aggression pact, open borders. It is, like I said, as pedestrian as it gets. There is nothing new about any of this. You can check out a profile, which will tell you what the various characteristics of these guys are, and these are very similar to the factions in Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri. These are basically the Gaians. That's the university, obviously. There's a couple of factions which are fairly similar to, God, what, the Hive? Can't remember if I think the Noxium, was it Noxium Corporation? Solar Dynasty, I think, is more like the Hive. And then you've got the Imperium, which is like the Spartan faction, and so on and so forth. There's only 6 factions available. There are a decent number of differences between them, like Fanatic, less unit cost there, Aggressive, Zealous. Usually there's 3 upgrades and a disadvantage available for each of these factions here, as you can see. And the theme sounds good, but thematically, they don't do a good job of making the diplomacy fit in with the theme. Now, if you remember, in Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri, the diplomacy was really, really good, and it allowed for all sorts of things. The multiplayer diplomacy was even better. It allowed you to craft all sorts of complex treaties and things like that. But honestly, Vivian doesn't seem to care that I just nuked somebody. Like, she doesn't seem to care that my entire area is completely run over with mines or anything like that. Even when I had high pollution, she didn't seem to care. In fact, Lady Vermilion was very concerned about that, which made no sense at all, because there's nothing in her backstory that indicates she'd be upset by pollution or anything like that. So, they don't act logically. The only logical thing they do is attack you if you're weak, even though you haven't provoked them in any way, shape, or form. As I said, Divine Ascension wiped me out 3 times out of 4, then I think it was the Solar Dynasty that wiped me out the other time. And you really need to build a lot of military units very early on, and if you do that, suddenly everyone wants to be your friend and gives you money. And that's very logical, but it's also very shallow. And that's unfortunate, and the diplomacy really does seem like something of an afterthought, which is, again, very unfortunate. This is the kind of game where good diplomacy is fairly vitally important, because it really means that the theme and the lore of the game contributes mechanically to it. And that's the biggest thing that Pandora misses out on. That is the thing which Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri nailed better than almost any other game in existence. And Pandora misses almost completely. Yeah? The lore matters in every way in Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri, right? You have to play your faction in the way that your faction is written. And you also have to deal with the other factions, unless, of course, you randomize the personalities, in the way that they're written. And you'd think you'd have to do the same thing here, but it's not really true, because the diplomacy system is not really that big a deal. And also the upgrades and the bonuses that you get as a faction, they make a decent difference, but they don't necessarily change your strategy in a huge way. You know, obviously I'm the corporate faction, so I have more money. But that also means I can just build more units. So, you know, why would I play the militaristic faction when I can just do that? So, I don't know, they don't feel defined enough, I guess. But more importantly, I don't interact with them in the way that I would have in Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri. And I wouldn't sort of be beating around the bush in that respect. As far as I'm aware, there doesn't appear to be kind of a planetary council of any sort that I can convene either to do advanced diplomacy and political stuff. Maybe I missed it in the research tree somewhere. I mean, this thing is a big research tree. I have no idea where that could be, actually. General population survey. I probably missed a lot. There is, honestly, a lot of stuff in this tech tree. And I've certainly cut past a lot of it, too, so There may very... Yeah, that's Planetary Council, but that's all it does. I knew I'd research this. The only thing that it does is it boosts diplomatic relations with all factions. Like, there doesn't appear to be a council system where you can all vote for different things, which is unfortunate. Again, that would have added to the diplomacy. They did try to be like Alpha Centauri in terms of the technology and kind of really pushing the story forward with little pieces of information. Like, once we get through this, and again, I don't think they're going to successfully attack me. That seems fairly unlikely. They are approaching me, certainly, but they're not going to be able to fight my units on my cities unless they start nuking me or whatever. We'll end the turn once again, and you'll see with the fusion beam thing, they're going to give me... Actually, they won't do that because I skipped forward, but if I look at that, it's going to give me a little bit of story. Just a smidge. Just a smidge. And they even tried to put a narrator in there as well. In some respects. Not all of them. In case of this weapon, there isn't anything there either. But in Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri, I keep bringing the comparison back because it's relevant, because that's exactly what the game is very, very similar to. They had quotes from all the faction leaders, and that really helped develop them as factions and give them a real amount of depth, and also give the lore and the world a lot of depth as well. Like, you really felt like these factions were real political forces with real in-depth ideologies. And also there was room for a bit of humor there as well. This game has a bit of humor in it as well, especially in the diplomacy dialogue, but most of it is very ham-fisted, and they also get the same voice actor whenever they do a technology quote, which, yeah, was very similar to the way Civ does things and everything. It's no Leonard Nimoy, I can tell you that for a fact. It's just the same female voice actor they get for everything, and unfortunately, it's not particularly well done. So that is what tied Alpha Centauri together, and that's what isn't done very well here, which unfortunately means that Pandora is not the clone, perhaps, that you were looking for. It's not that it's bad, yeah? It's not that it's bad at all. It's very solid. That's the way I describe it. And solid, actually... Wow, they're attacking me. Incredible. They actually might win this fight. We've got to do something about this. Good lord. Where are my new aircraft? Let's go gun down all this stuff. There we go. That's what I get for only leaving artillery behind there. That's not well defended. Let's, we'll add a Goliath Mech. Somehow I have a feeling that they're not going to want to fight that. There we go. That's that wiped out. Let's go sink something over here. Avenger tank gets sunk. That's what we like to see. And we'll go sink you too, if we can. And we can. So overpowered. It's solid. It does what it's supposed to do, and it does what it's supposed to do well. But it doesn't do anything amazingly well outside of, as I mentioned earlier, the... Oh, put on echo for me. The UI. Yeah, that works pretty well. And the randomized tech tree does mean that you do get a reason to kind of replay things, because the game certainly does develop in different ways every time as a result of that tech tree randomization. As I said, I haven't even researched a single flak weapon this entire game, and it's unlikely that that would happen in either a Civ game or in something like Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri, because the tech tree kind of forces you down those paths. You have to get that stuff eventually. Maybe you miss out on one tier of weapon, but you'll usually get different weapon types, and frankly, a lot of the weapon types within Alpha Centauri were kind of the same thing, they just attacked a little bit harder. There were definitely some exceptions to that, especially once you get later down the tech tree, but unit customization in general is okay, and with the addition of devices, you can do some pretty neat things. You know, these Goliaths are a lot cheaper now because I decided to put an upgrade on them, but I could make a very attack-focused Goliath. If we go back to the workshop, for instance, like, hey, here's a tank. What can I do to it? Quite a lot, you know? Advanced cost computation would be very good on long haul, I think. That would allow them to attack multiple times, or I could put a Xenomorph Theropod on there, which would allow me to capture native aliens, Deadlock Illusion Field, that's plus 25% defense, double experience, heal everything in the area, unit takes no damage when attacking successfully. That's pretty beastly, what can I say? So, you know, this is all pretty good. It's the customization anyway in terms of the units is probably on the level of Alpha Centauri, though you are missing some of the cool stuff. Like, there aren't any kind of submarines, there only seems to be one type of aircraft. The Goliath Mech is very cool. You don't seem to get another version of that as far as I'm aware. Ooh, artificial atmosphere, very cool. I think I want that orbital cannon, honestly. Yeah, let's get that, and let's skip forward a few turns so we can just show it off and see what it does. So, it's decent. It's decent enough. I think it very much lacks character, and once you get to this stage of the game, the only thing to really do is declare war on people. I'm so powerful that it's unlikely any of these guys can really fight me. Maybe I have to turn up the difficulty a little bit, but that is probably going to result in an early game defeat as per usual with this kind of thing. And since the diplomacy is so limited and the end game goals, the victory conditions are also very, very basic, as in own 75% of the population, which is the military victory. You can do new watercraft. That's kind of cool. There we go. That's not a watercraft. That is, though. That's a pretty cool looking boat. We like that. Could put a fusion laser on that thing, or a Gunther artillery. That might be quite nice. There we go. That could work. Can I combine that with... Oh, no. Oh, I can. Oh, that's overpowered. Wow. Multi-shot artillery. Gotta love that. There is... I believe research 75% of the text before everybody else does, and also have so much money that you can buy out 75% of the population, the economy of the game, and that's it. So there's no kind of transcendence goal or anything like that, and the cornering the market goal from Alpha Centauri isn't really there either. It's kind of there in spirit, but cornering the market was an aggressive action that would cause a bunch of people to, like, declare war on you, and you had to defend your main city for a certain amount of time until you could complete the procedure and everything like that. So, again, kind of a missed opportunity. Have some nuclear missiles. There we go. Just because we can. Gotta love that. It's now a wasteland. Ouch. Unpleasant. So, my conclusion is that it feels like an attempt to play on the nostalgia for Alpha Centauri. They did a good job of remaking the interface. They did actually a seriously good job of remaking the interface. But, and this is the biggest but, in doing so, they missed what created kind of the soul of it all. The lore that tied it all together. The planet actually being an entity and being a real force to be reckoned with later on, as well as being tied in with the story and several of the factions. None of that is there. And that means, like, it does feel like it's trying to borrow the soul of Alpha Centauri, but doesn't quite understand it, and only gets bits of it. It certainly feels and plays like Alpha Centauri, but it doesn't play as well as Alpha Centauri. Or indeed Civ 5 or anything along those lines. You know, Civ 5 has the obvious lore advantage of being based on real history. The fact that Alpha Centauri was able to put together really good lore for something that wasn't based on real history, but had a couple of ties to current-day ideologies, that was really clever. And it's just an example of Sid Meier's absolutely amazing game design. Unfortunately, this game doesn't quite make it there. I'd love to tell you that it did. I really, really would. That would be kind of incredible if it managed to pull that off, but it didn't. That said, it is a small team, and they did make a very solid and playable 4X sci-fi strategy. I certainly enjoyed my time up to this point. Like, I'm kind of bored at this point because I can buy anything in the game and nobody's a threat to me, but that can happen from time to time, unfortunately. But things like, if they do another game like this, they do need to work on diplomacy. They've definitely got to work on world building. They've got to work on lore. They need to maybe take another look at the tech tree and make some more interesting weapons. I like the fact that there is a sniper weapon type and there's a flamethrower weapon type, which is good against biological units and things like that. But we need more of that. And once you get further down the tech tree, what you tend to find is, outside of researching some of the really cool operations, which all have individual effects, it's like, oh, I get the next version of that. Alright, I understand there's got to be an element of that, but diversify, more weapon types, more unit types, more everything types, and then, frankly, if you do that, then your research is going to get very, very, very interesting indeed. But it's certainly lacking in many areas, but it is a very competent product that I think you may enjoy if you're into 4X strategy games. So, not too bad. Not brilliant. Needs a lot of work. A good starting point. Certainly very much so. Ladies and gentlemen, yeah, why not? You can have some peace. I'm feeling like it. I'm just researching amazing technology to kill you with later anyway. One final thing to mention, because I did promise I would do this, no, I didn't forget, is to take a look at the setup. So, as you will notice here, these are the options you got. World size, a few different options here. World shape. Difficulty level. Totally unfair, this. Alien aggression. Nasty, nasty. And the pace of the game. And then if you head over to Advanced, you can play with a few more things. This is the coolest, yeah? The revealed research tiers. You can randomize all of this. You could actually have none, so you have no idea what your next tech is going to be after the current one. That's pretty cool. You can also turn on Allied Victory if you so desire. Of course, that's fairly relevant in the multiplayer. And you can switch around the factions, and you can actually set them to teams individually if you would prefer to play with teams from the very start. So there you go, folks. Pandora First Contact, available on Steam for $30 or your regional equivalent. My name has been TotalBiscuit. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.